Hello everyone, I'm Anthropomantic Fiend, and usually I do horror-related things on the internet, but today I wanted to talk about something else that is also a passion of mine, so I've decided to start a new series talking about my love of fantasy. I'm calling this series Flights of Fancy, so welcome, and as you know, today's video is going to be about all things Alice in Wonderland, which is one of my absolute favorite things in the world outside the realm of horror, although it does have some crossover with horror, of course. I really enjoyed this story the first time I read it. I actually first saw the Disney 1951 movie, which I found hysterical, and it really brightened my day the first time I watched it, and then I obsessively watched it, like, every day for a whole summer, and then read both books and fell in love with all the other adaptations, and I just went deeper down the rabbit hole, as it were. As I've grown, I've discovered so many different things that I love about it. The thing that really got me into it at first was the sort of escapist aspect, the whole bizarre, fun fantasy world that it created, but then there's also just the aspect of this child at odds with the adult world and seeing how nonsensical it really is, which is one of the parts that resonates the most with me now. But there's also a lot of just really clever wordplay and logic games and all of these elements and references to Victorian society that are really, really cool. And there are a million spin-offs and adaptations, most of which I appreciate on some level. So this is such a wide playing field that I'm just going to go off of the things that I have in my collection, which is still a lot, and I'm not going to talk about them in depth if I can help it, because I do like to go in depth with this stuff. Before I get into this, I do want to mention a few things that aren't in my collection. First of all, the 80s Russian Alice movie, which I've talked about before. I will put the director/animator's name down here because I love his work in general, but I don't want to butcher his name. He created this really beautiful, bizarre version of Alice with a lot of stop-motion animation interacting with this little girl, but it's this bizarre world of rundown toys and bones and broken glass and taxidermy animals, and it's actually pretty disturbing, but it also has a great sense of humor, and it is one of my favorite, if not my favorite, adaptations of the Alice story. Also, there's the American McGee Alice games, which I have not played, but I have watched a lot of playthroughs of them and a lot of cutscenes and read a lot about them, and I absolutely love those stories as well. That is another one of the darker takes on the story, which sort of uses Wonderland as a reflection of the traumatic stuff that Alice is going through in the real world in a way that I think is really, really cool. So without further ado, let's get into the collection, shall we? This is not arranged in any linear way, much like Wonderland, but I'm going to start with books, I'm going to move on to things that are in plastic cases, and then I have a few toys or collectibles. Ripping the band-aid off at first, this is Alice in the Country of Joker. This volume is Circus and Liar's Game, and this is part of a bigger Alice manga series, which I read for a little while, but looking back on it, it's not great. The art style is really pretty, which is probably the main reason I liked it, but it's really uncomfortably sexual in a lot of ways that I really hate, and it really is all about these weird affairs and relationships going on with Alice and a bunch of different characters in Wonderland, and looking back on it now, there's a lot of really gross stuff that went over my head, and I kinda don't like it, but I might revisit it just to see, but I don't really want to. This is a thing that exists, the art style is pretty, but I don't especially recommend it. And of course, here is the original book, or rather the original two books, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass. This is a used copy that I picked up. It also includes a little end thing talking about film adaptations of Alice in Wonderland, and a little logic game short story piece by Lewis Carroll called What the Tortoise Said to Achilles, which is going into a lot of the crazy logic game stuff that he does in a way that I really, really enjoy, sort of taking off on the tortoise and the hare race, except that apparently the tortoise is racing with Achilles, very much in the same vein as Alice in Wonderland. I haven't read it in a long time, but I remember it being fun and mind-bendy. Then we have Gregory Maguire's After Alice. I have not read this in a while. It's been a long time. Again, by Gregory Maguire, who wrote the Wicked books, which I have not read, but I read this and I really, really enjoy it because it is Alice's older sister basically following Alice down the rabbit hole and trying to figure out what's happened to her and what's going on. It is a story happening parallel to the events of the original book, and it's really well thought out in terms of what the older sister is seeing and attention to detail in terms of what Lewis Carroll put into the original book, because this is specifically for Alice's adventures in Wonderland, not Through the Looking Glass. I remember this being really, really good. I do highly recommend this book. Here's a really old, battered copy of Through the Looking Glass, which I believe I grabbed from my grandmother's house a while back. I've always loved this installment of the story because of the way it's mapped out like a giant chess game. Lewis Carroll has legitimately thought out all of the moves and how the events of this story progress the chess game, how stepping from square to square, Alice transitions to different parts of the Looking Glass world, the way characters move through time and space is in conjunction with the chess game. Alice can only move linearly through time because she's a pawn, but the queens can kind of move however the hell they want. The White Queen remembers things before they happen because she is moving backwards across the world. It's just really well thought out, and there's a lot of great logic stuff in this one. It gave me a greater appreciation for chess as well. I played a lot more chess after I read this book. Here is a copy of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. I think this is the first copy I ever had. This one I got from my other grandmother's house, I believe. This one does not have the original John Tenniel illustrations that everyone's so familiar with. This one has these really lovely, in their own way, illustrations by Malcolm Ashman, which I really like. Here's Alice falling down the rabbit hole. And here is the White Rabbit running away from Alice in the Room of Many Doors. This is one of the first copies of the book I ever owned, and I still cherish this one because it's got really beautiful illustrations and just has sort of a nostalgic place in my heart from when I was first getting into the Alice story. This is not technically Alice in Wonderland, but it is very much in the same vein and probably very inspired. This is Neil Gaiman's Neverwhere, which is about Mr. Richard Mayhew, who slips through the cracks of reality, as it says on the back of the book, and ends up in the London Underground, which is actually a parallel London underneath London. It sort of takes the map of London and creates a whole fantasy world underneath it that is really beautiful and twisted and well thought out, as most of Neil Gaiman's work is. This might be my favorite book of Neil Gaiman's, but he is my favorite author, and I love so much of his work to pieces that I can't really pick, but I do highly, highly recommend this book. Also in the Neil Gaiman vein, we can't talk about Alice-inspired stories without talking about Coraline. This, of course, is the terrifying children's book about a girl who moves into a new apartment and discovers a parallel world through a tiny door where she evidently has another mother and father, but things are probably too good to be true. There is a lot of Alice in the character of Coraline in the way she's sort of at odds with this bizarre world. I wouldn't exactly call the Beldam a Queen of Hearts type character because she is so sickly sweet to Coraline. The Queen of Hearts is just a spoiled brat. They are both very sort of overbearing, older female characters, and then the cat is very much in the same vein as the Cheshire Cat in that they come and go from the world as they please, and they don't really care about the rules, as most cats are. Really creepy little children's book, but beautiful writing, some of my favorite from Neil Gaiman. Once again, I highly recommend it if you've not read this for whatever reason. Another copy of both Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass here. This has some of my other favorite illustrations for the book from Arthur Rackham, who does a lot of great fantasy art on the cover, but it is just the Tenniel illustrations inside, and this is the copy I bought to annotate for my high school English class when we read it for that, and that lesson kind of pissed me off because basically all people were reading into the stories at some point in time was sexual stuff, because someone brought up that Lewis Carroll, or Charles Lutwidge Dodson, which was his real name, was probably a pedophile, which he probably was, but there is a lot more to the book, and he's dead. We can separate the art from the artist in some ways, but the fact that that was all that people were reading into the story really pissed me off, because I think there's a lot more to the story, and in a lot of ways I feel like Through the Looking Glass is him sort of trying to let go of his obsession with Alice Liddell. I don't know if it worked, but I think there is some of that in Through the Looking Glass. But regardless, another nice copy of the book, even though I've marked it up so much with angry annotations from my high school English class. This is Untamed by A.G. Howard. This is part of the Splintered series. This is actually a fourth book of parallel short stories, but the Splintered series is about a girl named Alyssa Gardner who discovers that she actually is descended from the original Alice and belongs in Wonderland, and this is a much darker Wonderland with a lot of bizarre insect imagery. She can also talk to insects. She can always kind of hear what they're thinking. She's an artist. She paints with her own blood. It's a much darker take on the story that I remember really, really enjoying. People have started talking about her book Roseblood, which is a teen take on Phantom of the Opera. I've heard a lot of people saying that her writing is actually trash. It's been a long time since I read these. I don't remember them being the best written, but I remember really liking them regardless. There are some weird elements from Tim Burton movies kind of shoehorned into the mythology here in a really weird way, but I remember really enjoying the sort of dark version of the Alice world that was created here, and I do recommend checking out the Splintered series. The second book in the Land of Stories series, called The Enchantress Returns, which is really only marginally related to Alice. This is about two kids who kind of fall into the world of fairy tales in general, and in the first book, it is really more focused on the sort of Brothers Grimm type stuff, as well as things like Jack and the Beanstalk and Three Little Pigs. But in this one, the female protagonist in this kind of compares herself to a lot of different characters, including Alice, as well as Dorothy from the Oz stories and Lucy from the Narnia stories. Near the end of the book, all of those characters sort of appear to her and talk to her and aid her in her quest, basically. I think in the later Land of Stories books, which I have not read, they actually do visit places like Wonderland and Oz. I don't know if they were able to get the rights to Narnia or if that was even a thing, but I think Wonderland and Oz are things in Land of Stories. It has been a really long time since I've read these books. I don't recall how good they are. I remember really enjoying them the first time I read them, but I also remember our mom reading them aloud to us and being like, I can't really get into these characters, they feel kind of flat to me. Don't know how well they hold up, but I do recommend giving them a shot. Another only marginally related thing is Cornelia Funk's Inkheart. I have not actually read this book all the way through, but I remember it being really beautiful and just a love letter to the world that books transport people into, and there are nods to Alice in Wonderland in places in this. I do remember watching the whole movie, which I don't know how faithful it is, but I remember enjoying the film. I need to give this book another chance someday, because I remember it being really good, but it's also just a really lengthy one, so I wasn't able to finish it. I just finished this book, and I absolutely love it. This is Heartless by Marissa Meyer, who wrote The Lunar Chronicles, which I have not read, but I've heard they're a good sort of sci-fi version of fairy tales. This book follows the character of Kath, who is being courted by the King of Hearts, which is creepy in its own way because of their age difference. She just wants to run away and start a bakery with the character of Mary Ann. She also falls in love with the court jester. She tries to play for time and try to find a way to get away and start her bakery and deal with the peer pressure from her family, who are trying to elevate themselves by marrying her off to the King of Hearts. This is a really, really good book. It really tore me to pieces at the end. It is not a happy book at all, but it is really, really faithful to the mythology of Alice in Wonderland, and it works as a perfect prequel to both Lewis Carroll books. It sets all the events in those books into motion in a really smart way. Marissa Meyer really, really knows her Alice lore, so if you have not read this, please read this if you like Alice in any way, because it is a perfect companion piece to both Alice books, but it is also just really depressing. And because I definitely need more copies of Alice, here's the complete works of Lewis Carroll. I've not read everything in here, but I have read both copies of the Alice books in here quite a few times. This also includes Hunting of the Snark, which is a good companion to the Jabberwocky poem because it does feature the Jub Jub Bird and the Bandersnatch, which are mentioned in there, but it is basically Lewis Carroll's spoof of an epic poem where a bunch of sailors go to catch an elusive bird that they call a snark. There's a little bit of a dark undertone to it in a lot of ways. It is also called An Agony in 8 Fits, which I think is a naming that they also used for the episodes of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy radio play, which I have not read, but there is definitely some influence of Lewis Carroll's nonsense there as well in a really cool way. So again, highly recommend both Alice books, and I also highly recommend checking out The Hunting of the Snark. Lewis Carroll's Puzzles in Wonderland. This is a book of sort of puzzles and mind games and riddles that includes a lot of really beautiful colorized versions of the original Tennille illustrations for the Alice books, and a lot of fun logic games that I used quite a bit when I was being homeschooled to sort of get my mind in shape for the day. And I remember a lot of the riddles in here being really, really good and really thought-provoking and very in the vein of a lot of the puzzles and mind games in both Alice books. This giant book called Alice's Wonderland that I absolutely love. I love this cover art, but this is just a huge look at all things Alice in Wonderland. It goes into some versions that don't usually get a lot of love. Here's the ballet, which I have not seen, but I've seen some stuff from it. I remember it being really cool. The Mad Hatter tap dances. There's also an opera that I discovered through this, which is bizarro and amazing. Lots of songs. There's even a page, for some reason, on porn versions of Alice, which I usually tend to skip for reasons. There's a page on the Care Bear's Adventure in Wonderland in here. This thing has it all, really, and if you really want to seek out all things Alice, this will, for the most part, have you covered in that regard. Now we are moving on from books into things with a plastic case, starting with the Tim Burton Alice stuff. So I saw this Alice movie shortly after I saw the 1951 version. It was probably the second Alice movie I ever saw, and I loved it. Looking back now, I can definitely see the flaws that it has, but most of them don't bother me. I still really enjoy this. There are, in the real world, some historical inaccuracies to the Victorian era, and the fact that they kind of give most of the credit for the slaying to the Vorpal sword itself at the end of the movie rather than Alice, even though this is supposed to be sort of her whole journey and character growth thing, kind of bothers me. But on the whole, I really enjoy this movie. Definitely not Burton's best, but a movie that I still have a lot of love for. And I enjoy the world and mythology of Wonderland that they created for this. Alice Through the Looking Glass. Ironically, I think there's a lot more of the elements of Alice in Wonderland in this movie, and a lot more elements of Through the Looking Glass in this movie, because this movie is really about the chess game between the Red and White Queens, which is what the original Through the Looking Glass about, and this is all about messing with time, which is a lot more what the original Alice's Adventures in Wonderland is about. I do really enjoy Sacha Baron Cohen's performance as Time in this movie. I think it's really fun. This movie is a lot more lighthearted than the Burton movie, which I think is to its detriment in some ways, because it kind of goes back on some of the dark stuff in the original, but I do still really enjoy it, and the CG has gotten better since the original for this one, and it is definitely a very pretty movie. The original Burton movie got its own video game adaptations, both of which I have played. These are actually the only 2 video games that I know of that I have 100% completed. But this one really takes a lot more from the art style of the original movie and manages to expand that world in a lot of ways that I think is really cool. The annoying thing about this is you do play as, never as Alice, but as the cast of characters helping her through Wonderland, like the White Rabbit and the March Hare and the Mad Hatter, and you all have special abilities that are fun, but you have to keep track of Alice at all times because Red Knights, who are the playing card soldiers, will find her and capture her if you don't keep proper eye on her, and if she gets captured, you lose. And that does get kind of annoying sometimes, but this fleshes out the world of Wonderland in a really cool way. And I've also done the DS version, which has this adorable, cutesy, Burton-esque style to it. Similar plot and similar dynamic where you have to keep an eye on Alice, and if you do stray too far from her, she will start crying, and the Red Knights will come and try to take her away, and if that happens, you lose, and it's kind of annoying, but I still really, really, really enjoy this game. There's also a lot more sort of snarky modern-day humor in this because they aren't bound by the rules of the visual style of the original, so they're not trying to imitate the sort of Victorian era too much. There's a lot more modern ways of speaking and a lot more goofy modern humor in this, which was fun. If you didn't know, my favorite band is Nightwish, and there is a lot of Alice in Imaginarum, particularly the album, but also the movie that they made in conjunction with it. In particular on the song I Want My Tears Back, which explicitly references Alice in a lot of ways and is kind of about wanting to reclaim the magic of childhood despite a lot of the sadness that comes with it. The movie itself is about an aging composer who seems to be dying, but it's also inside his head as a tiny child, kind of exploring his fantasy world, and there's some Wonderland in that. Not a lot, but some. I just kind of wanted to throw this in there because of I Want My Tears Back, and I do highly recommend both this album and this movie. They're both beautiful and some of my favorite things ever, and kind of heart-wrenching. Also, in the vein of things that are mostly just Alice inspired, we have the iconic classic Labyrinth. I don't even know what to say about this. If you haven't seen this or you don't know what it is, you are missing out. Go watch it right now. But in terms of a young girl kind of getting lost in this fantasy world that may or may not be a dream, it is very similar to Alice. We kind of see a lot of Alice-y things in her room at the beginning of the film, and it has some of that fun, nonsensical, riddle-filled fun to it in a similar way to Alice. I do think it is in that spirit in most of the best ways, and of course you've got people like David Bowie, Jennifer Connelly, and Jim Henson working on this thing. You've got Brian Froud working on this thing. The script is written by Terry Jones of Monty Python fame. It is just awesome. And I already mentioned Coraline. This is, of course, the amazing Henry Selick stop-motion movie. One of the first things I think Laika worked on. Beautiful stop-motion. Excellent adaptation from Neil Gaiman. One of the movies that really traumatized me as a child. I, for the longest time, refused to watch this movie ever again. And then gradually, I kind of found myself more and more intrigued by it. And finally, I went back and watched it, and I read the book, and I fell in love with it all over again. I kind of mentioned all the parallels to Alice already when I talked about the book, so again, if you haven't seen this, this is a must-watch film. Of course, there are a lot of Alice references in The Matrix as well. There's the Follow the White Rabbit stuff at the beginning, and a few other little nods to Wonderland, and this does deal with bending reality and the mind and dreams versus reality. I do really enjoy it. Sequels, not quite as good. Really enjoy the Animatrix, though. And I do enjoy all of these films. I think the Wachowskis are fantastic directors. And then finally, a few of the collectibles and such. I've had this little Hatter for years. You might have seen him in my room tour. He's adorable. The Ed Wynn version of the Hatter was part of why I fell in love with the Alice story in general. That tea party scene had me cackling the first time I saw it. He is just an absolute delight as the Hatter, so I'm very happy to own this adorable version of him. And I do also really enjoy Johnny Depp's version of the Hatter as well. This is, of course, a Funko of him. I like the sort of bizarre, pale look that they gave him, which a lot of people might sort of just chalk up to Burton being weird and Burton-y, but there was a lot of talk about hat making and the way mercury affects your mind and your body, and that having a lot to do with the look of him. And then there's also the way his accent changes depending on his mood. He's usually kind of British when he's happy, and then he turns very, very Scottish when he's angry, and his eyes also change color with that in a way that I think is really cool. Another one you might have seen if you saw my room tour, I have this adorable little Funko Pop of Sarah from Labyrinth and the Worm, who I think is actually named William, but that's never said in the movie, but they're both, of course, adorable, and I've already talked at length about Labyrinth and why I love that movie so much. That is my whole Alice in Wonderland collection and a bunch of my thoughts on this story. I definitely recommend checking out a lot of this stuff. If you have favorite Alice-related things that I've not mentioned in this, please let me know, because I am always, always, always intrigued. Thank you for watching my video, and hopefully I will see you in another one. Bye!